Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by again. Look, if you saw my last video, we did a sort of deep dive into the recent Elections Canada decision to basically say that declaring climate change real is a potentially partisan activity because Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada doesn't really believe that climate change is either real or man-made caused or human caused or whatever. And we talked about how that was an absurd policy and how, in essence, you're sort of making facts partisan, you're making reality partisan, but you're also just making speech that may be political, but that isn't expressly partisan. You're sort of branding it as partisan just because it may agree or disagree with one particular political party's vision. And my hope was that Elections Canada would realize that this was a silly policy and that they would, quickly change course and issue a clarification saying that, there's a big difference between saying climate change is real, which is not partisan, and saying climate change is real, aka don't vote for Maxime Bernier and the People's Party, which is partisan. And they seem to be saying that actually these two things are potentially the same thing, and they are doubling down. I'm going to read you a quote here from a Canadian press piece on this issue in an updated sense. It was released just a couple hours ago. Elections Canada says it will decide on a case-by-case basis whether discussing the legitimacy of climate change becomes a partisan issue for third parties during the federal campaign, and only if it receives complaints. Does that not strike you as the worst possible response? Not only do they want to keep the bad policy, but they're not actually willing to do any of the work to codify what their bad policy is. Like, it's bad enough if they say, yes, this is partisan, but here is precisely how it's partisan, and here is precisely how and when and if we'll enforce our rule about, calling climate change real and that being partisan. Here they're making an open admission that they don't really know the rules either. They're going to decide on a case-by-case basis, which is totally arbitrary and which has no place in Election Canada, policy books, because Canadians have to know that their electoral process goes beyond case-by-case decisions and really has a fundamentally, consistent core. And the most crucial part here is it's based only on complaints. Groups that rankle the ire of PPC candidates or groups that rankle the ire of climate change deniers are going to be targeted, and Elections Canada will look into it in those cases. But if a group, for instance, says something and it doesn't happen to get called out, even though it's more definitively partisan, Elections Canada might ignore it. So you're giving an incentive for people to effectively scan the internet for anything that talks about climate change that they may disagree with and then report it to Elections Canada as partisan speech. So in a sense, Elections Canada is going to not be, an arbitrator of a fair rule that we may disagree with, but that is consistent, but they're sort of going to be there to just respond to online trolls who don't want us talking about climate change at all, and they're going to use Elections Canada as a means of silencing groups or chilling those groups from speaking. And all of this is really unacceptable. All of this is. Again, I don't want to legitimize this bad decision, but if we're going to have it, it has to be consistent and fair and transparent. And Canadians need to know exactly what is and isn't partisan, and therefore, which groups are running afoul of the rule and which aren't. This is the worst of both worlds. It's a bad policy with no sort of consistent implementation of rules around it. So what are we going to do about this, guys? I think the only thing we can do is we all need to write to Elections Canada. I will post a link in the description where you can write a complaint to Elections Canada, and I hope you do so, because we all need to take a stand here and let them know that talking about climate change is not a partisan form of speech unless you're specifically mentioning party policies and party positions either for or against them. And that if we are going to have these rules, at the very least they need to be extremely fair and extremely transparent and cannot be based off complaints and or case-by-case basis. That's the very least. So guys, we have to push hard and we have to push now, because groups are already curtailing their speech because of fear of being caught up in this bad net. The piece notes this that I've quoted. I'll put a excerpt here, that groups are already being constrained in their speech because of Election Canada interpretations. That's unacceptable. If we can get them to change their policy now or clarify their policy now, we can ensure that those groups won't have their right to speech infringed during this election period.